If everybody could take a seat. Well, thanks for coming this evening, and happy Mother's Day to all the mothers in the audience. We thank you for coming out, especially on this beautiful spring evening in Jamestown. And thank Mr. Burson, Mr. Dreyfusss for flying in or driving in today, and we appreciate your attendance. We're here to participate in some recollections, some remembrances of an event that was, as we all know, so defining in Justice Jackson's career and in his legacy, and that being the Nuremberg trials. Mr. Burson, to your right there, was an Army news correspondent for American Forces Network, where he did 15-minute nightly broadcasts covering the trials, and was one of a few reporters who actually interviewed Justice Jackson during the trial. He is a graduate of University of Mississippi and a veteran of World War II. He served his country as a combat engineer in France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. He later founded Burson Marsteller, a leading global public relations and communication counseling firm. He has recently been described by PR Week as the century's most influential PR figure. Allan Dreyfusss, to his left, was a young reporter covering the trial for Stars and Stripes. Stars and Stripes is a daily newspaper for the U.S. military and others. Between the end of testimony and the handing down of verdicts, he wrote a summary of the charges against each of the 21 defendants. His work was published in a booklet titled These 21, and it has recently been reprinted with a new foreword from his vantage point 60 years later. We encourage every couple to take a copy. It's out in our lobby. To make events like tonight happen, we have terrific support from the community, from businesses and others in the community. I'd just like to mention a few of them tonight. Blackstone Nail Ultrasonics, Gene Phaneuf is here with us. The Jamestown Area Chamber of Commerce, Jamestown Community College, Route 1A Advertising in Erie, Pennsylvania, Schultz Auto Group, the Robert A. Madam Senior Valley of AASR Fund, the Whitney R. Harris Lectureship Fund over at the Community Foundation, and the World War II Legacy Fund. We have also received the booklet, These 21, free of charge from Stars and Stripes and Margaret Irish. So without further ado, I'll introduce Greg Peterson, who will be giving you a little brief introduction on what's going to happen tonight and how this all came about.
Thanks, Adam, and as you know from prior experiences, you are a studio audience, as we have an opportunity to interview a couple of individuals who were part of the Nuremberg process. That's part of our legacy at the Jackson Center. Since we're a little more than 7 years old, we've had this opportunity on several occasions, and it is always a wonder to me how some of this all comes together. And I'll just share briefly maybe the serendipity of how this goes. A few years ago, I had a chance to read the book, many of you did, on Nuremberg, Infamy on Trial, authored by Joseph Persico. 1994 book. And in that 1994 book, it outlined a number of people and acknowledged a number of people who assisted him in that process. And among those were Allan Dreyfusss and Harold Burson. Now, over the last several, and it told me, frankly, at that time in 1994, those two guys were alive. That's good news if you're trying to get interviews. So over time, since we started in 2001, we've tried to track down some of these folks. And Joe Persico was able to use a list that Dreyfusss Sprecher put together, and Dreyfusss had a reunion in 1996. Well, Dreyfusss, during my interview with him, was nice enough to give me that list. And on that list, it listed the names, the general participation, and kind of where they were living. My daughter goes to school in Lansing, Michigan, and you got to know how strange a guy I am. I'm cruising along in my car, and I also bring my camcorder, that thing right there in the back, because I just simply never know when lightning will strike. So here I am cruising along, and I see a sign that says Ann Arbor, 20 miles. And in the back of my mind, and Allan's laughing because this is so true, somewhere in Ann Arbor was one of those people who was alive in 1994. So I have this little sheet, and I'm driving, and I'm rifling through it because it's trying to find out. Sure enough, Ann Arbor, look up, it's Allan Dreyfusss. Get on my cell phone, it says now Ann Arbor, 10 miles away. So I call on my cell phone, and one Allan Dreyfusss answers the phone. And he was kind enough to say, you are who? And I said, I am Greg Peterson, and you do what? And I'm with the Robert Jackson Center, and what's your intentions? You know, he was really grilling me. I said, I'd like to interview you. What day? Today? When? I'm now 5 miles from Ann Arbor. So if I could, like right now, would that be okay? And so the good sport that he was, he received me, actually got me into his house, received me, and we sat down and had an hour-and-a-half interview, which got more interesting because as part of what Allan Dreyfusss wrote while at Nuremberg was a book entitled These 21. And he showed me that book. And it was written published in 1946, compilation of his articles in the period of time between the actual conclusion of the Nuremberg trial and the sentences. So nobody knew, but he cataloged each individual 21 defendants, of which we have pictures variously around the Jackson Center here. So I thought, gee, wouldn't it be great if I could find a copy, but that was pretty difficult. So I then reached out to the folks at Stars and Stripes, thinking somehow, some way in their archives they might have an extra. Well, they were thrilled to find out that I found Allan Dreyfusss. Their question was, he's alive? Wonderful. We were just thinking about the possibility of reprinting his book since it was the 60th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial. I said, not only is he alive, but I interviewed him. They said, great, give me his contact, his coordinates, and send me the interview. So I did. They got a hold of you. The next thing you know, there is a reprint. Next thing you know, segments of my interview are now part of the Stars and Stripes website. And because it's on their website, it's now on our website. We thank them for doing all that for us. And so that was kind of the Allan Dreyfusss story. And I thought, well, gee, I'd interviewed him. That was fun. And now that's part of the archives of Jackson Center. And they did a reprint. And in fact, were kind enough to send us a couple copies. It gets better. Then as part of the Persico book, the folks at St. Louis, this is the Whitney Harris Institute. They sent me some information. They got an email from one Harold Burson. This is Harold Burson of Burson Marsteller. Whoa. And find out that what his role was, and he is also all over. I'm now going back to the Persico book and finding out Harold Burson's. Now, remember, this is Harold Burson of Burson Marsteller. I wonder, how am I ever going to break through the plate glass and to get to him? Well, fortunately, we did. And as we were talking the first time, you may not remember this, Harold, but you said that, by the way, in your travels, have you ever come across an Allan Dreyfusss? Hey, funny you should ask. Listen to this story. And then he went on to tell me that, in fact, not only were they colleagues at Nuremberg, that, in fact, Harold was in Allan's wedding 47 years ago. And they had not been together in one place and one time for 20, 30 years, maybe. And I thought, what magic it would be for them, for us, to have two folks who were intimately involved at the Nuremberg trial. One, the radio world. As Adam mentioned, Harold wrote the transcripts wrote the transcripts for the Armed Forces Network broadcast from Nuremberg. Allan's writing for Stars and Stripes. So here it is. You got the personal side, a reunion of sorts. You're just seeing it right now, folks. And the fact that it would be something special because we've never had a chance to really talk to those who covered the trial. So this is magic on many fronts. Now, I must also pause and say that there are some three special women, earlier today referred to as Allan's harem, who really made this possible. His daughter, thank you, A.E. Dreyfusss, thank you very much for coming in to New York City, to Ann Arbor, to be willing to drive Allan here today so he could have a chance to reunite with Harold Burson. This is a magic moment. You're watching, folks, and I just want to share it because I'm really choked by the fact, and hopefully we'll get to this interview and I'll stop talking. And to Pat and Rachel, really, to make it all a special effort to make sure that Allan got here today. And I look forward to the next 24 hours, and this will be the first, really a neat thing. So I want to pause because a lot of stuff happens at the Jackson Center. And sometimes I don't fully understand how it all happens, but this one did. Call it serendipity, call it whatever you want to have, but ladies and gentlemen, Harold Burson and Allan Dreyfusss are here for the first time in a very long period of time, and they're here certainly for the first time at the Jackson Center, and I'm thrilled. And before we start the interview, I'm going to show a quick 10-minute movie. I don't know, Allan, if you could maybe flip around, which will help put into perspective the news covering of this event, the Nuremberg trial where Robert Jackson was the chief American prosecutor. So let's turn on the lights and we'll watch this.
Marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
Robert Jackson was on leave from his job as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He was appointed as the lead United States prosecutor in Nuremberg by Harry Truman. Jackson didn't attend college and completed only 1 year of law school. He became an attorney by serving an apprenticeship. He served as both Solicitor General and Attorney General before going to the High Court. While other World War II allies originally wanted summary execution of Nazi war criminals, the United States pushed for a trial. Jackson hoped that the proceedings at Nuremberg would create new international law outlawing aggressive warfare. His opening statement ran for the better part of a day and is considered by many to be one of the great pieces of oratory. The excerpts we're showing you were taken from the 10-month-long trial. All of the trial was audio taped, a portion was filmed. For those sections not filmed, we've used freeze frames of the film. Now, Justice Jackson's opening statement.
I will now call upon the Chief Prosecutor for the United States of America.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
No single news event received such attention as the trial at Nuremberg. Representatives of press associations, large newspapers, radio networks, magazines, and newsreels from all parts of the globe were accommodated. Correspondents were housed in a castle on the Faber estate owned by Baron Faber-Castell, one of the leading pencil manufacturers. The camp had 7 buildings in all and was equipped to house and feed 650 correspondents. Located about 6 miles from the courthouse in the town of Stein, Bavaria, it was the only place large enough to accommodate journalists covering the trial. Because they were occupied by various German and U.S. Army combat units from 1942 to 1945, a considerable amount of work had to be done before the buildings could be made habitable. The Germans used the tower of the castle in 1942 for a radio station, and later some of the buildings were used by the German and Allied armies as field hospitals. Elaborate press facilities were set up to accommodate correspondents assigned to cover the trial. Press activities centered in one large press room where loudspeakers carried the court proceedings. Allied correspondents representing 23 nations covered the trial in Nuremberg. Representatives from major networks, press associations, newspapers, magazines, and newsreels from all parts of the world made sure the public received the story of the trial of the war criminals. In addition, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia had news staffs which covered the trial for licensed German newspapers in their respective zones. Former SS men and German war prisoners were pressed into service carrying captured documents into the press room, which are used in court to prove the case against Nazi war leaders. There was little of their former arrogance about them. Under guard, they performed menial tasks about the courthouse. As the documents were introduced into evidence, they were made available to the correspondents in the press room. Captured documents made public for the first time revealed the war plans of the Nazi regime and the ruthless manner in which they carried out their plans for world conquest. Correspondents are shown helping themselves to the mass of documents used to prove the case against the Nazi war leaders. Communications facilities for correspondents were adjacent to the working press rooms and were set up so correspondents could file stories to points all over the world in a minimum of time. During the first week of the trial, correspondents transmitted a total of 1,224,895 words. Transmission agencies included RCA, Mackay, Press Wireless, and TASS. In addition, teletype machines were installed to handle traffic to London and Paris. Correspondents for the United Press had seen firsthand the destruction brought about by the 21 men in the dock. Among the staff covering the trial was Walter Cronkite. All pictures taken inside the courtroom by commercial photographers were placed in one common pool and made available to all wire services and newspapers requesting pictures. In order to avoid any disturbance in the courtroom, special lighting fixtures were installed to obviate the use of flash bulbs. Photographers worked from assigned positions and rotated to ensure good coverage from all possible angles. Radio commentators broadcast from 5 soundproof booths equipped with earphones which carried the proceedings to the courtroom. Proceedings were recorded on discs, film, and wire. Radio commentators were permitted to select any portion of the day's proceedings and play it back over the radio just as it came from the court, or use portions of it, supplemented by their own commentaries. Commentators from America were Howard K. Smith of CBS, Roy Porter of NBC, H.R. Bawkage of the American Broadcasting Company, and Arthur Gaith of the Mutual Broadcasting System. In addition to the four major networks from the United States, the London BBC and the American Forces Network broadcast the trial.
Hello, America. As Christmas descends upon this sad and broken city, I'm here inside her great palace of justice. And on this Christmas Eve, as we're filled with thoughts of peace on earth, it is here that the future of peace may well be determined.
And I do not wish even to discuss that, for I was an officer, a soldier. I served my country.
Now I ask
Thirdly,
you this. Your
I was
Honor,
not,
please.
Thirdly, I was not the man to forsake someone to whom I had given my oath of loyalty every time he was not to my way of thinking.
Your Honor.
It never, ever occurred to me to leave the Fuhrer.
Your Honor, the witness is adopting a contemptuous attitude toward this tribunal, which is
Giving him the trial that he never gave a living soul nor dead ones either.
Objection, Your Honor.
I'm ready for the next question.
I think this is probably a good point to adjourn for the day.
Tough goals from the bench.
Well, it's only round one. Think you need anything? Don't forget, I'm here.
As the week ends, there's a consensus among all present that Hermann Goering now appears to be in control of the court. Will Jackson, will anyone be able to stop him?
It is against such a background that these defendants now ask this tribunal to say that they are not guilty of planning, executing, or conspiring to commit this long list of crimes and wrongs. They stand before the record of this trial as blood-stained Gloucester stood by the body of his slain king. He begged of the widow, as they beg of you, say I slew them not. And the Queen replied, then say they were not slain, but dead they are. If you were to say of these men that they are not guilty, it would be as true to say that there has been no war, that there are no slain, that there has been no crime.
Just doesn't get much better than that. Extraordinary oratory.
Though I understand you're just a couple years older than Harold and seniority prevails here. I suppose you've just seen some things here, some clips which I wanted to just sort of get the mind clicking a little bit. Maybe a quick perception of what you just saw before we kind of get into the biography.
I get sort of an onrush of impressions watching the stormtroopers at Nuremberg, the massed flags, and the sheer might of all of those marching battalions. And one wonders secretly how the boys from Kansas, from New Jersey, from Upper Maine could get together and crush this threat to humanity. It looks like almost an impossible job when you just see the size and the dimensions of this power. But by goodness, the small spark that got people to enlist, that drew people to make sacrifices that were unheard of in humanity, these things galvanized all of this allied response to this barbarism, this untold, unheard of barbarism, and delivered not a perfect solution, but certainly left no doubt in anybody's mind how horrible Nazism was, and that good people of good intent and with strong wills getting together could accomplish the impossible. And I think that is one of the strongest lessons that comes out of all of this massing of Nazi humanity. And the people who deny it now, they are virtually in a class like the heads of Myanmar. And I can enlarge on this, but I think it's a good time to go on with other subjects. So.
We'll do that with your junior member here, who's a mere 87. Harold, what was your thought? I mean, because you saw these impressions that flashed by. Did anything flash back to you?
Let me give you a more micro view. This was one of the great events in history. And I think that the people who were there realized as much that history was in the making. And you can only imagine what it meant to someone who was 24 years old at the time. And just to give you an indication of the importance which was attached to this by the High Command of the United States Army, and particularly U.S. Armed Forces in Europe. I had just joined American Forces Network about 3 months before the Nuremberg trials. I had gone through the war with a combat engineer organization, and was very fortunate in being able to get transferred out of it into American Forces Network when the war ended. And one day I got a call from the commanding officer of American Forces Network, who was a colonel. And people like Allan and I, who were reporters and correspondents for the military magazines, newspapers, AFN, all of us were enlisted men. And, going up to a colonel's office, I had no idea why I was going up there. And he called me in, asked me to sit down. And, of course, I saluted him, yes, sir, no, sir, and so forth. And he said, how would you like to go to Nuremberg and cover the trial for us? And we'd been talking in the newsroom for several weeks as to who was going to get that assignment. And my first question was, why me? And he said, for 2 reasons. He said, or 3 reasons. He said, number one, we think you're capable of doing it. Number 2, we don't think you have any political baggage that we should be concerned about. And number 3, you're going to be around long enough to cover most of the trial. And so I was flattered even so. And he said, before you go, you've got to go over and see General Thompson. And that was the general to whom Stars and Stripes, AFN, all the educational activities of the Army reported. And to tell a guy who was a corporal he had to go over and see a major general, you know, this was like me going in to see the Pope. So I went over there, and he said, I have specifically asked Colonel Hayes to send you over here because I want to tell you why we are going to give the coverage that we're going to give. And he had already told, my own Colonel Hayes had already told me, you're going to get 15 minutes a night, every night that the trial is in session. And 15 minutes of talking on a radio about a news event is a lot of time. And so he said, as you probably know, the most credible news medium in Germany is American Forces Network. And I really didn't know that at the time. And I said, I'm surprised to hear that. He said, the research that we have done indicates that the people who speak English believe that the American military command will not lie to its troops, that its troops get the straight news. And he said, we want the German people to know what went on in this country for the past 6 or 7 years. And he said, we've also got 1.5 million troops over here still. This was November after the war and ended in May. And he said, I'm going to give you my card. He said, I know that you're an enlisted man. He said, but we want you to have every privilege that any other correspondent has. And if anybody, any officer tries to deny those privileges to you, call me. And he said, further, he said, we're going to give you a Jeep. And you'll have your own transportation so you won't have to depend on anybody. And literally, of the 600 correspondents there, I was the only one who had wheels. And that's one of the reasons Allan was such a good friend of mine, of course. But it was very important because that winter was the coldest winter still on record in the history of Germany. And it was about, I thought it was about 8 miles from the castle to the courthouse. But in an open Jeep, it was still a lot better than waiting for one of those jitneys to take you back and forth to the courthouse. So I was very popular with the correspondence. I would say one thing about the film. I think Hermann Goering was badly cast in that movie. I think Hermann Goering is one of the most awesome people that I have ever seen in my lifetime. And he was a much more beguiling and subtle figure than I thought was portrayed on that screen. I thought Justice Jackson did a remarkable job, but he lacked really one thing, and that is he, as an American, he did not know as much of the history as Goering did. And it really remained for, I think, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe to really get Goering to break down. But it was, I've been through a lot of experiences in my lifetime. I've met a lot of people. But I think my 5 or 6 months at Nuremberg were as remarkable an experience I have ever had. And I'm still profoundly affected by it.
Give us a little timeline of how you ended up in Nuremberg.
My military career was, to say the least, checkered. I dipped my nose in an awful lot of things. Not voluntarily, but the Army had plans, I guess, for me. And to make my long story a bit shorter, I was drafted in, I didn't enlist, I was drafted. I was drafted in Chicago. I went to a place called Camp Grant, and from there I was eventually seconded into something called the European Civil Affairs Division, which made a specialty of selecting people who had any knowledge of foreign languages in the hope that they might serve in an army of occupation. And that was one thing that led me to this rather strange and zigzaggy career in the military. I was. They heard that I had worked on newspapers, so all of a sudden I got a request, actually an order, to report to the Stars and Stripes. I had stuck my nose into the office of the Stars and Stripes in London, and I'd done a little work there, but not an awful lot. And eventually, this turned out to be sort of fortuitous because they passed my dossier on to other Army newspaper organizations, and one of them assigned me to Le Havre in France. And I for about 6 weeks, I guess, I did my best to cover all of the ports and all of the ships coming in. But then, all of a sudden, I found myself with an order to report to Paris, and it was the Paris Bureau of the Stars and Stripes, and they weren't sure exactly what they'd do with me, but they always could use another body on the copy rim, and so I wound up reading copy and writing headlines for about 2 or 3 months. And then all of a sudden, a chap named Arthur Noyes, who had been on the Chicago Tribune, came to me and he said, "Allan," he said, "I'm not very well and I'm going home." And he'd been covering the Nuremberg trials. He and a man named Stod White from Detroit. And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, we'll lose you, but what does that have to do with me?" And he said, "I think they'd like you to go to Nuremberg and cover the trials." And this was just as the trials were beginning. And I had little or no knowledge about the background of it, except I knew that the bad guys were supposed to be accused. But I went, and I hardly had time to change the ribbon in my typewriter, and I was in Nuremberg. And the first day, I found I was supposed to cover a trial, a deposition by someone who was giving it on the Nazi side. And I did my best, according to my own lights, kept veracity high above everything else, and I guess it must have been satisfactory, because one of the majors came up to me and said, "Congratulations," he said, "you're going to handle Nuremberg." and there were a lot of applicants, a lot of people who would have been probably much better than I was. But I seized it. This was a great chance, and I covered the first trial all the way through, and then I covered pieces of almost all of the 10 or 11 trials that went after that. I would stick my nose in, not do it on a regular basis, but I was able to get a good feel for what was going on, and I guess it worked out. We won.
Because of your reporting.
No.
Curious, Harold, did you get a sense of the history of it all? When you're there, or was it a job and you're accumulating points to get out of town?
No, of course, I had read a good deal about what was going on in Germany, probably a factor of my being a first-generation American. My mother and father came to this country about a year before I was born from England, and although I grew up in the South, I did not grow up in a typical Southern household. My father was very interested in foreign affairs, and he expressed a great deal of concern as the Nazi movement was forming. I can still remember the day that when Hindenburg lost the election in 1930. I was 9 years old, but I remember exactly where I was when my father found out about it, and I was with him, and how upset he was. So I knew this was a really historic occasion, and did I bring to it the maturity that I hoped I could? Probably not. But I tell you, I went for probably about 25 years and did not look at my scripts. I very fortunately was able to hold on to every script that I wrote. And I brought them back with me and had them copied and so forth and so on. And sort of put them away. And about 20 years ago or so, I read them. And I said, this was pretty good for me. And the BBC just, it's 2 years ago now, in 2006, did a 3-part series, an hour each, on the 60th anniversary of the trials. And they asked me if I would participate, and actually I not only participated, but I was one of the technical advisors on the film. And I read my script again, and this was 60 years after the fact. And I was even prouder of myself then than I was 25 years ago. And basically, what I was doing, I was not coming up with very many profound observations. I was just reporting what happened. And to fill my 15 minutes, what I did was, and which is one of the most interesting part of it, I'd do about a 5 or 6 minute news report, and then do an interview with someone who had to do with the trial. For example, a prison psychiatrist, a translator, somebody who was working as an attorney, both on the German side and on the prosecution side. One of the things that I wanted to do from almost day one was to interview Justice Jackson, and got to know his press officer, and a man named Gordon Dean, who later became a very close friend of mine. And Gordon told me that he probably is not going to do any press interviews. He just doesn't want to put himself in the spotlight. Also, this was a trial, and he's going to treat it as a trial. And so I was very disappointed and started thinking about it and went back to Gordon and said, Gordon, this is not an ordinary audience that I am serving. I'm serving the people who fought in World War II and made this trial possible, and I think it's incumbent upon Justice Jackson to tell the troops why he's over here. And Gordon said, it sounds pretty good to me, I'll tell it to him. It came back to me the next day and he said, you've got the interview. And we both had our names in the papers all across the United States the next day.
And in fact, it starts January 31st, 1946. And good evening, this is Sergeant Ted Piers in the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. Last week, AFN correspondent Harold Burson submitted a list of 6 questions to Mr. Justice Robert H. Jackson, the Chief United States Prosecutor at the Nuremberg War Crimes Trial. These questions are the questions the GIs themselves have been asking ever since these proceedings began. To provide the answers, we've invited Mr. Justice Jackson to speak directly to the American forces in the European theater. So with this in mind, Mr. Justice Jackson, and then there are the questions. How did it actually work? Did you ask the questions?
I asked questions.
Transcribed?
I didn't go on air. I had, back then, a much deeper Southern accent than I have now. And I can put it on, really, if you want me to. But, back in those days, and for a number of years after, the radio networks had thought you had to have these news announcers who had these pristine accents and, great diction and so forth and so on. It's been relaxed a little bit now. American Forces Network was such a remarkable organization because it had such diversity of talent, not only on the news side, writers, but, for example, we had a repertory theater that consisted of Marlene Dietrich, Mickey Rooney, Celeste Holm, Sam Wanamaker. These were people who were between their USO assignments, and we did had a group from Hollywood who did original dramatic productions for them. It literally was the greatest radio network that ever served the world for the simple reason that we got access. At that time, there were 4 radio networks in the United States. We got everything that they did, and we could put them on. Our Sunday night had Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Bob Hope, Jimmy Durante, whereas they were all spread around the other networks. But we had this lineup that was just absolutely magnificent. So it was a great experience for all of us, and it was everything was extremely professionally done. And I had never had any radio experience before that. And as I look back on it, I sort of pretty pleased with myself.
And I think part of what we saw on the screen a few minutes ago from the movie was from Joseph Persico's book, which was directly from your participation. So that what you saw was really, Harold, this is to help me give more acknowledgement for that film, of which I didn't appropriately probably acknowledge. Allan, did you find that when you, as you were writing, first of all, where were you physically in the courtroom? I mean, how did it really work?
We had a press gallery. It was sort of a roped off section of the audience, and they were splendid seats. You could practically lean over and whisper in Goering's ear. We didn't. But you had a splendid vantage point, and you could observe everything that was going on amongst even the lesser lights of the Nazi regime. People like Fritsche, who was a propagandist, Streicher, who was a dreadful anti-Semitic pornographer. These people were sometimes located physically to the back of the prisoner's box, but your vantage point was such that you could watch them, you could almost overhear them, and it was an unbelievable experience for them as was in this place, you know.
Did you take your own notes here as we're going? You didn't get transcripts the next...
In some instances, the German text was translated, was given verbatim, and you could translate some of it. But I spoke only a little German, and I wasn't competent enough to do the whole thing. But it was made available, and the press section was most generous in making biographies and all sorts of background materials available to the people.
Harold, was your sense same thing?
I think, Allan, almost all the documents were translated into English.
Yeah.
And so, you had the documents that were translated, and I took notes on, what the lawyers were saying, the questions that they were asking. And basically, a typical day was you'd get to the court, and it started at 10 o'clock in the morning. And they would run until about 12:30, and then there was a recess until 1:30 or 2 o'clock, I think. And then it went from 2 until 4:30. And what I did was I went back to the castle, and I did all my writing at the castle. So I had about 2 hours, in which an hour and a half to 2 hours to get this 7 or 8 minutes, because I would work on the other stuff at other times, the interviews with other people at other times. And then we'd drive back down to the Palace of Justice with the announcer who read my scripts. And we had a landline from the Palace of Justice to our AFN station in Munich, which was about 125 miles away, and it got on the network that way. But I would go down every night at 9 o'clock at night, and we would go from 9 to 9:15. One of the interesting things about it is that not once was I ever criticized for anything that I said or wrote or any of our interviews. I got a number of letters of commendation, but not once did any of my superior officers criticize me for coverage that I did, and I covered everything as straight as I possibly could. And there were some things where I was critical of the U.S. Position in handling things from time to time.
If you want to read it, Harold was kind enough to send the transcripts to the Jackson Center, so we thank you for that. Was there any sense of, you talked about maybe somebody looking over your shoulder just in a critical format, but was there any sense of censorship as to what you might be sending out? Did your boss, Allan, look over your shoulder?
No, I think people were sort of imbued with a sense of responsibility. It was not just loose lips, sink ships, but as people wrote, they wondered about the ultimate use to which the materials might be put. And in many cases, this stayed the flow of ink and made people think twice about whether they would send send a certain story. And it wasn't just, it wasn't self-censorship.
Were the German population interested in the Nuremberg trial?
No. Not originally. But I think that eventually, as the proceedings were translated into German more and more, and some of the American or Allied points of view were given translations, the Germans began to realize exactly what had happened.
Is that your experience too, Harold?
Yeah, you know, I was in Germany for about a year after the war, and I have since been to Germany probably 50 times, and it's a very important market for Burson Marsteller. And I have yet to have someone admit to me that they knew that there were concentration camps. And you know, I have very close friends in Germany. And the only ones who admit that there were concentration camps were foreigners who lived in Germany at the time. And so I think that has changed a great deal today. I think the Germans have done about as much as a country can do in the way of reparations, in the way of recognizing as a government the sins of the past. But the individual Germans who were of my generation and the older generations were totally in denial, I think. And this was something that, you know, just couldn't be handled by 500 people or 5,000 people or even 500,000 people. It was going on in front of the eyes of a lot of people there.
Harold, I'm going to read something here. This is what you wrote on November 21st, 1945, the American Forces Network, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. Good evening. This is Corporal Cy Bernhardt. The small courtroom in Nuremberg today knew no walls, no boundaries of either time or space, for it was today that an impassioned and magnificent opening address, lasting almost 4.5 hours by Supreme Court Justice and United States Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson, sought to encompass the memory, the conscious, and the future hope of mankind. The spectators in the court knew today that they were conscious participants in the shaping of modern history, and the 20 defendants, with one exception, in contrast to their generally indifferent attitude of yesterday, were intense, alert, and active listeners. And at times in the closing stages of the 61-page speech, their tired, aging faces reflected many passing thoughts, many remembrances of glories now past and dead. It describes a remarkable scene. What was your impression of Jackson? I mean, now you're 60 years later and its legacy?
I think he was masterful in that opening statement. The place where I felt that Justice Jackson was not as strong as Sir David Maxwell Fyfe was in the interrogation of Goering. And the reason for that is that Maxwell Fyfe just knew so much more about what the history was than Justice Jackson did, which was natural. For me, the most dramatic moment in the trial, which I think is shown in the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, is, you know, Goering knew he was going to die. And he was glad to die if they gave him a soldier's death, which meant by firing squad. The reason he was putting up the resistance was he did not want to be hanged. So, and this was because of his honor as a soldier. You know, he won the equivalent of the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Iron Cross, twice in World War I. So he so he's very proud of his honor as a military man. This dramatic moment was that Maxwell Fyfe starts questioning him about treatment of prisoners of war. And the argument got to be one on, there were 4 American airmen who were hanged for trying to escape. Justice Jackson had talked with him about him and finally dropped the subject. Maxwell Fyfe comes back to him and says, Justice Marshal Goering, what is your first obligation as prisoner of war? And he says, to escape. And he said, what would you think of a military officer who, having captured men who had tried to escape, who ordered them to be executed? And Goering went on and said this was the worst thing it could possibly be. It was beyond the soldier's honor to do that, such and such. And Maxwell Fyfe brought out the document that had Goering's name on it. It was really a very, very dramatic moment in the trial, and it really almost destroyed Goering. And after that, he just collapsed. And I think that, I think what I read of, I've read many times Justice Jackson's summary closing arguments, which I thought were brilliant also. There's no doubt about it. I think that he did an excellent job, and against really enormous pressures. They had to clobber together these, all the attorneys to go there. It was a very short time frame. In June and July, they were still recruiting lawyers and the strategy didn't really get set until maybe 2 or 3 weeks before the trial went on. And just getting this thing processed. He had very little cooperation from any of the other countries. This was an American production. It was a movie. It was the executive producer was Justice Jackson, and you could hardly even give associate producer status to the other prosecutors, because even the English, Churchill was not very much for the trial. And so it was something that Justice Jackson just really pushed through, and he had a lot of resistance along the way.
Talking about Goering, Allan, I'm going to read a little piece that you wrote, and then get a reaction. This is from These 21, and make sure you pick up a copy as you leave. And Allan wrote this, 4 Stars and Stripes, between, again, the conclusion of the trial and knowing there was obviously going to be a verdict. Did you know when the verdict, by the way, was going to come to date? Sort of set a timetable?
Not certain, no.
Okay. So you took each defendant and wrote an incredible piece. The sum total of those was this booklet. And you wrote on Goering, after almost 10 months of sitting in the historic courtroom at the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, losing 50 pounds and a flip disregard for the dignity of the occasion, Hermann Goering waits for the judgment of the court on his actions as number 2 man of Nazi Germany. The sober-visaged number 1 defendant, who reputedly has been the keystone holding together the organized defense of the 20 Nazi conspirators in the dock, presents a far different picture from the pompous, bemedaled egocentric who waddled through the high offices of the Hitler government, carrying out the mad designs of its leader with callow disregard for the human rights and decency. As it was ending, the trial was ending, what was your sense of Hermann Goering? From, let's just say, day one, you walk into the courtroom and you see this guy who you'd seen in newsreels. That's reaction 1. And then you watch him progress during the next 10 months. What was the metamorphosis there?
Well, I think he made a conscious effort to maintain his reputation. This was, and yet the visible signs of his deterioration were everywhere to be seen. He lost weight. He wasn't as quick with his responses. They weren't as acerbic or as damning as they were before. And he really showed a flip disregard for the opinions of the court, really. And how much he could have been brought down or should have been brought down is a question of debate. But the fact that he committed suicide, he died that way, rather than stand up and argue any of these points, I think probably he was worn down by sort of a carborundum of despair. He just had gone through an awful lot, and he would find people like Justice Jackson ready to rebut any of his rather feeble, at the time, defenses of his position.
We saw in the film that was portrayed by Alec Baldwin, certainly a highly emotional Robert Jackson. Is that how it played out in real life? I mean, I realize drama, it takes its...
I don't recall it that way.
Yeah.
I think Justice Jackson was very self-controlled. I don't remember, his any emotional outbursts from Justice Jackson.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was the soul of moderation.
Right.
And he'd choose his ideas over before he'd release them to the public.
By the way, this is just part one of part two. Part two is going to be tomorrow. And I want to go on forever, but I know that you guys have come great distances here, and I don't want to wear you out completely because I do want part two. To kind of draw closure, maybe just to tonight's part, Allan, I'll ask you first. What's your sense of the legacy of this all? I mean, now you've had a chance to reflect on 60 years ago, the conclusion of the Nuremberg trial. That ultimately resulted in a Nuremberg Code, which was adopted by the United Nations, with perhaps a goal that this would be a deterrent. What's your sense 60 years later?
Well, unfortunately, I find that rather than any concrete result, the whole Nuremberg process is wrapped in an amorphous fog. People aren't sure of what it stands for. And the fact that you can have Myanmar and martinets disregarding human need and human suffering to this degree, and I don't mean to just focus on the Far East, but that seems to me to be a very graphic example of the lack of pervasive, far-reaching influence that the Nuremberg trials have had over a period of time. People quote them, people refer to them, but the proof of the pudding is in the way that the world responds to this cruelty and this excess.
Harold, what's your sense?
I was rather idealistic when I covered the trials, as that opening statement would indicate. As I have gotten well advanced in years, it's still a matter of the victor tries the vanquished. It takes the victor to go in and get the culprit, the perpetrator, and bring them to a court which one could say is more neutral than the court at Nuremberg, as in the case of the Yugoslavian. I'm having a senior moment. Milosevic, yeah. But it's still, you know, we don't have that ideal situation that I think we had hoped for back in 1945 and 1946. But it's precedent, and I am thankful that the world had that experience, and it's on the record. And hopefully at some future time there will be a situation where a totally independent court can try and not have to be the victor to do that.
And I thank both of you for making an extraordinary effort tonight on part one. Part two tomorrow, by the way, will be at 12:30 here at the Jackson Center. And on behalf of the Jackson Center, all of our friends and sponsors here, thanks so much for participating tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, Allan Dreyfusss and Harold.